She was 20 years old, and by the reckoning of everyone in Redstone County, she had just made the worst decision of her young life. Her uncle, Garrett Doss, the only family she had left after the fever took her parents 2 winters before, had grown tired of feeding a niece he considered a burden rather than a blessing. And on a cold March morning, he told her plainly that she had until the week's end to find somewhere else to be. She left his house with $9 she had saved from selling eggs and mending clothes, a shawl her mother had knitted, and a stubbornness that had gotten her through worse than this. With that $9, she bought what everyone in the county agreed was the single most worthless piece of ground for 20 miles. A collapsed, sun-bleached farmhouse on cracked, barren soil that hadn't yielded a decent crop in a decade. Land so poor that even the man who sold it to her seemed embarrassed to take her money. She thought she was simply buying 4 walls and a roof to keep the wind off her back. She did not yet know that beneath the rotted floorboards of that farmhouse lay a secret buried nearly 40 years earlier. One that would prove the land was never worthless at all, and would give an entire forgotten community back something it had grieved as lost forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Margaret Vance. If you have ever been told that something you loved, or something you owned, was worth nothing at all, tell us in the comments. We would love to hear how the story turned out, and how you came to understand its worth was never for anyone else to decide. Margaret Vance had been raised to believe that ground remembers. It was a strange thing for a farmer's daughter to be taught, and stranger still coming from her father, Elias Vance, a quiet, deeply religious man who worked a modest homestead outside the town of Amity Hollow in the Nebraska Territory, and who spoke of the soil the way other men spoke of Scripture, with reverence, and with the conviction that it held more history than any single lifetime could account for, that every furrow plowed and every stone cleared carried forward, in some fashion he never fully explained, the labor and love of the hands that had shaped it. Elias had come to that stretch of prairie in 1858, one of the first families to settle what would become Amity Hollow. And he had watched, over the following 2 decades, as a scattering of hopeful homesteads grew into a modest but genuine town, complete with a schoolhouse, a mercantile, and a small congregation that gathered, in the town's earliest and hardest years, not in any proper church, but in whatever barn or parlor could hold them. Margaret grew up hearing her father's stories of those early years the way other children heard fairy tales. Stories of hardship shared and burdens carried together, of neighbors who had once been strangers becoming, through nothing but repeated kindness, something closer to family. Her mother, Ruth, had been the town's unofficial keeper of records before any formal office existed to do the job. She kept track of births and deaths, of who owed what to whom, of which families had helped which others through a hard winter, in a careful hand that Margaret came to recognize as its own kind of devotion. It was from her mother that Margaret learned patience with detail, the discipline of writing things down precisely so that memory would not have to carry the whole burden alone. And it was from her father that she learned the deeper conviction beneath it all, that a community's true wealth was never the visible kind, never simply the crops in a season or the coin in a strongbox, but the accumulated trust of people who had chosen, again and again, to look after one another when it would have been easier not to. The land holds what the people put into it, Elias used to say, resting his palm flat against the dry earth of their own modest fields, long after the people themselves are gone. Margaret did not fully understand what he meant by this until she was much older, and by then, the understanding would cost her nearly everything before it gave her back more than she ever expected. Margaret's childhood, for all its hardship, was rich in the ways that mattered least to a bank ledger, and most to a growing girl's heart. Her father taught her to read the sky the way he read scripture, to know a coming storm by the particular color the western horizon turned an hour before it broke, and to understand, without ever being told outright, that a farmer's real harvest was not merely what came up out of the ground, but what he left behind him in the character of his children. Her mother taught her needlework and letters both, insisting that a girl who could not write a clear, legible hand would never be trusted with anything of consequence. And Margaret took to the lesson eagerly, filling the margins of her mother's household ledgers with careful practice sentences until Ruth declared, with evident pride, that her daughter's hand had grown finer than her own. Her mother was not unkind exactly, but the outbreak that took Reverend Pratt and 10 others had left a mark on the whole congregation that Margaret only came to fully understand as an adult. A collective grief so raw in those early years that the chapel itself, when it was finally built, became less a building than a promise. The physical shape of a community's determination that such loss would never again go unmarked, unremembered, uncared for. Elias spoke of that winter rarely, and always in the same hushed, careful tone he reserved for Scripture, and Margaret grew up understanding, without ever quite being told outright, that the chapel on the rise above their farmland was not simply a place of worship, but something closer to a covenant. A promise the founding families had made to one another in their darkest hour, and had meant, every one of them, to keep. She was 12 years old when tragedy first touched Amity Hollow, in a way the whole town still spoke of in hushed voices years later. A diphtheria outbreak that swept through the small congregation in the winter of 1878, taking 11 lives in the span of 6 brutal weeks, including the town's first minister, a gentleman named Reverend Josiah Pratt, who had baptized half the children in the county, and who had, in his final delirious days, begged the families gathered around him to promise that whatever became of the town, they would not let what he had built be forgotten. In the raw grief that followed, a small group of the town's founding families, the Vances among them, quietly built a modest stone chapel on a rise of land at the edge of Elias Vance's own property, a place to properly bury their dead and to gather, at last, somewhere consecrated and permanent rather than borrowed. Margaret remembered, faintly, being carried to that chapel as a small girl for a Christmas service, remembered candlelight against gray stone and her father's hand warm around hers, though the memory had grown soft and uncertain with the years, the way childhood memories do. What Margaret did not know, what almost no one still living in Amity Hollow by the time she was 20 years old still remembered, was that the chapel her father had helped build no longer stood where it once had. A second wave of drought and hardship in the mid-1880s had driven half the town's families away entirely. The little congregation had dwindled past the point of sustaining itself, and in the confusion and quiet grief of that slow unraveling, the chapel itself, along with the small burial ground beside it, had somehow been lost to memory almost as thoroughly as the people it once served. Its exact location blurred by 2 decades of changed property lines, collapsed structures, and the deaths of the very people who would have known precisely where to look. By the time Margaret was old enough to ask her father more about it, Elias himself had passed, taken by a wasting illness when she was 17. And her mother followed less than a year later, worn down as much by grief as by any sickness the doctors could name. It was this loss, layered atop an already hard life, that left Margaret entirely alone in the world at 19, dependent on the grudging charity of an uncle who had never wanted the responsibility and made certain she knew it. Garrett Doss was not a cruel man in the dramatic sense. He raised no hand against her, spoke no truly vicious word, but he possessed the particular, wearying cruelty of a man who makes his resentment felt in 1,000 small ways rather than one large one, who sighs audibly at an extra plate on the table and remarks, more than once and always, where she could hear it, that a niece who did not work the fields like a son was a poor bargain for the food she ate. Margaret rose before dawn each of those 2 winters to earn her keep twice over, tending Garrett's chickens and mending his family's clothes and scrubbing floors that were never quite clean enough to satisfy him. And still, she went to bed most nights with his low, muttered complaints about the cost of her following her down the hallway like something with a scent she could not wash off. His wife Delphine was not unkind exactly, but she was too tired and too occupied with her own 5 children to spare much warmth for a niece she had never asked to raise, and Margaret learned in those 2 years the particular loneliness of living in a full house where no one especially wanted her there. She endured 2 winters of this before the fever that had taken her parents seemed almost gentle by comparison, and when Garrett finally told her, that cold March morning, that she had a week to find somewhere else to be, some small, tired part of her felt something closer to relief than fear. She had, after all, survived worse than uncertainty. She had survived losing everyone she loved. She left with her $9, her mother's shawl, and a battered tin box containing the only possessions she had refused to leave behind, a handful of letters, a pressed flower from her mother's wedding day, and a small, worn Bible that had belonged to her father, its spine cracked from decades of use. She had no clear plan beyond simple survival, and it was more chance than intention that led her, after 2 days of walking and 1 uncomfortable night sheltering in a stranger's barn, back toward the outskirts of Amity Hollow itself, a town she had not seen since her mother's funeral, and one that had continued its slow decline in her absence, its population thinned to perhaps 1/3 of what it had been in her father's day. It was there, on the edge of what had once been prosperous farmland, that she found the collapsed, weather-beaten farmhouse and the parcel of cracked, barren ground surrounding it, being sold off by the county for unpaid taxes at a price so low it was almost an insult. $9, the entirety of what she had left in the world, for land that every farmer in the county agreed had gone sour, sitting atop soil too depleted and too poorly drained to grow anything worth the effort of planting. She bought it anyway. She told herself, standing in the wind-scoured dooryard of the ruined farmhouse with the last of her money spent, that she had simply needed a roof, however broken, and 4 walls, however cracked, and that this was the only roof and the only walls that $9 could buy her in the whole of Redstone County. She did not yet know that the ground beneath her feet was not, in fact, a stranger's worthless land at all. Her first weeks in the farmhouse were spent in the plain, unglamorous business of survival, patching the worst gaps in the roof with scavenged boards, sweeping decades of dust and dead leaves from rooms that had clearly stood empty far longer than she had been alive, and trading the last of her $9 remainder, a few dimes at most, for a small sack of cornmeal, and a promise of eggs from the nearest neighbor willing to look past her circumstances. She slept those first nights on a pallet of her own shawl and whatever clean straw she could gather, waking each morning stiff and cold but strangely unafraid, comforted in a way she could not fully explain by the plain solidity of walls, however broken, that no uncle could tell her to leave. It was in her second week, working to clear space for a proper hearth fire before the spring rains came, that she noticed the parlor floor sounded wrong beneath her feet, a hollow, uneven give in one section that no amount of settling or rot alone seemed to explain. She discovered the truth almost by accident, in her second week of living in the half-ruined farmhouse, while she was attempting to pry up a section of warped, rotted flooring in what had once clearly served as a parlor, hoping to salvage the boards for patching the worst gaps in the roof before the spring rains came. Beneath the third board she lifted, instead of the packed earth she expected, Her makeshift pry bar struck something hard and hollow-sounding, and clearing away nearly a foot of accumulated dirt and debris, she uncovered what appeared to be the top of a narrow stone stairway, descending into darkness beneath the farmhouse floor. It took her the better part of an anxious hour, working by the light of a single lantern with her heart beating high and fast in her throat, to clear the stairway enough to descend it, wondering with each cleared step whether she was about to find nothing more than an old root cellar, or something worse, some forgotten grave better left undisturbed. What she found at the bottom, half collapsed but unmistakable even after decades of neglect, was the interior of a small stone chapel, an altar still standing at one end, a scattering of collapsed wooden pews, dust hanging thick and undisturbed in the still air of 2 decades' silence, and, carved into the stone lintel above what had once been the chapel's main door, now buried and long forgotten above her head, a single weathered inscription, built in memory of Rev. Josiah Pratt, and all who could not be forgotten. 1878. Margaret sat on the chapel's cold stone floor for a long while that night, her lantern casting trembling shadows across walls her own father had likely helped raise with his own hands, and felt something she could not immediately name. Grief, certainly, for a history she had only half remembered as a child. But also something that felt almost like being found rather than finding, as though her father's old conviction that the land remembers had reached forward across the years to catch her exactly where she needed to land. She traced her fingers along the cold stone of the altar, imagining her father's hands on those same stones decades before, imagining the candlelight and the singing and the particular hush of a community gathered together in grief and determination. And she understood, in that quiet hour underground, that she had not simply stumbled upon an old ruin but had been led, by some chain of circumstance too improbable to be entirely coincidence, back to the very heart of everything her parents had believed in. She understood, slowly and with growing wonder, that the collapsed farmhouse above her, the one everyone in the county called worthless, had been built, deliberately or by simple coincidence of later ownership, directly atop the very chapel her father had helped construct in the aftermath of Amity Hollow's darkest winter. The chapel the town itself had believed lost for nearly 20 years. The following morning, working with more patience than haste, she began a careful search of the chapel's ruined interior, uncovering, tucked into a stone alcove behind the collapsed altar, and protected by a simple lead box that had kept out 2 decades of moisture and decay, a leather-bound record book that she recognized, with a jolt that stole the breath from her chest, as her own mother's handwriting, the careful, precise script Ruth Vance had used to keep the town's earliest records. The book was not, as Margaret first feared, simply a duplicate of records already known. It was something far more significant, a complete accounting of the chapel's founding congregation, meticulously listing every family who had contributed labor, money, or goods to the chapel's construction, along with a separate ledger in her mother's same careful hand, recording a modest communal fund that the founding families had established alongside the chapel itself, money set aside, according to Ruth's notes, for the relief of any family among us who falls, through no fault of their own, into hardship the rest of us are able to ease. The fund, according to the final entries, had been deposited with a territorial bank in the nearest sizable town, held in trust under the chapel congregation's collective name, and had, so far as Margaret could determine from the dates, never been formally closed or distributed when the congregation itself dissolved, simply forgotten, the way the chapel itself had been forgotten, buried beneath the same slow unraveling of memory that had scattered half the town's founding families to hardship and distance. It did not take Margaret long to understand what this discovery meant, nor long to understand that she was not the only person in Redstone County who stood to benefit from it becoming known. She spent the following days, before ever venturing to Fenwick, sitting alone in the restored quiet of the chapel each evening after her farmhouse chores were done, reading and rereading her mother's ledger by lantern light until she had committed whole pages of it to memory. The careful entries told a story richer than she had imagined even as a child, hearing her father's fragments of it, not merely a list of names and sums, but a portrait of a community that had, in its hardest year, chosen deliberately and repeatedly to bind itself together against hardship, rather than let each family fend alone. There were entries recording a widow given 3 months' provisions after her husband's death in a threshing accident. A young family lent seed corn after a hailstorm destroyed their planting. A note in her mother's own hand beside one entry reading simply, "Given freely, and never to be repaid," for that was never the purpose. Margaret found herself weeping more than once over those pages, not merely from grief, but from something closer to awe at the plain, unglamorous goodness her parents' generation had built, and then, through no fault of their own making, allowed the world to forget. When she made her first careful inquiries at the bank in the neighboring town of Fenwick, seeking to confirm whether the old Congregational Trust Fund her mother had recorded still existed, she found that the institution's current president, a sharp-eyed man named Cornelius Abbott, was considerably less forthcoming than she had hoped. Evasive about the fund's exact status, quick to suggest that any such account, if it had ever existed, had surely been absorbed long ago into the bank's general holdings through the ordinary passage of time and unclaimed property law, and visibly, if carefully, alarmed when Margaret produced her mother's ledger as evidence that the fund had been deliberately and permanently established, not simply forgotten money waiting to be swept away by a bank eager to claim it as its own. Margaret left that first meeting with Abbott understanding, with the same clear-eyed patience her mother had brought to every careful entry in her ledgers, that she would need more than her own memory and a single old record book to force a reckoning. The weeks that followed tested her in ways the loss of her parents and her uncle's cold charity, painful as they had been, never quite had, for this was not simply a matter of enduring hardship, but of actively pressing a claim against a man with money, position, and the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being believed over a penniless young woman. Abbott, she learned through careful, quiet inquiry, was not without allies of his own. He sat on the county's small board of commissioners, was well regarded by the circuit judge who occasionally passed through Fenwick, and had, in the years since Amity Hollow's decline, quietly absorbed no fewer than 3 other dormant accounts from families who had left the territory without ever formally closing their affairs, a pattern that suggested, though Margaret could not yet prove it outright, that the chapel fund was very likely not the only forgotten trust the bank had grown comfortable treating as its own. She spent the following weeks doing quiet, careful work, traveling to the handful of Amity Hollow's founding families who remained in the county or nearby, showing each of them her mother's ledger and asking whether they recalled the chapel fund, whether any among them had ever attempted, in the confused years after the congregation's dissolution, to claim what should rightfully have gone toward the community's relief. She found the Hargrove sisters, elderly now, still living in reduced circumstances on what remained of their family's homestead, who remembered the fund clearly and confirmed that no one had ever successfully claimed it, the paperwork and knowledge of its existence having simply died with the generation that established it. She found old Ezekiel Torrance, who had been a boy of 10 at the chapel's founding, and who wept unashamedly at the sight of Ruth Vance's careful handwriting, saying he had not seen anything so plainly good and longer than he cared to admit. Armed with these testimonies and her mother's original ledger, Margaret returned to Fenwick and to Cornelius Abbott's bank, this time not alone, but accompanied by 3 of the founding family's surviving members. And this time, she did not simply ask politely whether the fund existed. She laid the ledger on Abbott's own desk, open to the entry recording the fund's original establishment and its explicit designation as a trust for community relief, and she asked him plainly, in front of witnesses who remembered the fund's founding as clearly as she now understood its purpose, whether the bank intended to honor a trust it had held, quietly and without acknowledgement, for nearly 2 decades. The room was small and close, and Margaret would remember for years afterward the particular quality of the silence that followed her question. Abbott's pen, which had been moving idly across a ledger of his own, going suddenly still, his gaze flicking from her face to the ledger and back again as though recalculating, in real time, the cost of the answer he was about to give. Abbott's discomfort was, by every account of those present, considerable. He attempted, at first, to argue that so many years of dormancy rendered any claim legally void, that the original congregation no longer existed to press it, that Margaret herself, as the daughter of one founding family rather than an appointed trustee, had no standing to demand anything at all. It was old Ezekiel Torrance, of all people, who answered him, pointing out, with the plain conviction of a man who had nothing left to lose, by speaking honestly, that the fund had never been established for any single family's benefit, including the Vances, but for the whole of a community that still, in its diminished way, remained, and that a bank which had quietly benefited from 2 decades of unclaimed deposits owed that community, at the very least, an honest accounting, rather than a legal argument for keeping what was never truly its own. The dispute was not resolved in a single dramatic confrontation, though the meeting in Abbott's office marked its turning point. Word spread through the surviving families of Redstone County with the particular speed that word of a wronged community always seems to find, and within weeks, enough of the founding family's descendants had come forward, corroborating Margaret's evidence and adding their own memories, and in several cases, their own scattered fragments of documentation, that Abbott found himself facing not merely one determined young woman, but a genuine, organized claim that no reasonable territorial court would easily dismiss. Rather than risk the public accounting a formal legal challenge would require, an accounting that would inevitably raise uncomfortable questions about how freely the bank had treated other dormant or forgotten accounts across the years, Abbott chose, in the end, the quieter and more self-interested path of settlement, releasing the trust fund, with accumulated interest that had grown it considerably beyond its original modest sum, to a newly reconstituted board of trustees drawn from the surviving founding families, with Margaret Vance as the one who had recovered both the chapel and the ledger that proved the fund's existence, named among them at the others' unanimous insistence. What Margaret did with her portion of that recovered trust, and with the discovery beneath her farmhouse floor more broadly, was, to the town of Amity Hollow, more meaningful even than the money itself. The restoration of the chapel took the better part of a year, worked on slowly through seasons when the farming allowed it, with Margaret herself directing much of the labor alongside a handful of men from the founding families who seemed to find, in the careful work of clearing and rebuilding, something of the same healing Margaret had found in first climbing down into the dark to see what remained. Old Ezekiel Torrance, despite his age, insisted on helping reset the altar stone with his own hands, saying he had carried the memory of that chapel's first service for 50 years and would not be kept from carrying stone for its second. The Hargrove sisters organized the women of the remaining families to sew new altar cloths and hymnal covers, working from patterns Ruth Vance herself had once used, patterns Margaret found, to her quiet astonishment, tucked into the back pages of her mother's own sewing basket, saved all these years without her ever knowing why. She did not sell the land, though offers came quickly once word spread of what had been found beneath it, Speculators eager to acquire ground with such an unusual history. Curious enough travelers willing to pay simply to see the buried chapel with their own eyes. Instead, she used a portion of the trust to properly excavate and restore the chapel itself, clearing 2 decades of collapse and decay to reveal once again the small stone sanctuary her father had helped build, its altar repaired, its inscription to Reverend Pratt cleaned and legible once more. She used another portion, exactly as her mother's ledger had always intended, to establish a standing relief fund for any Redstone County family who fell, through no fault of their own, into hardship. A fund administered, at her insistence, not by any bank, but by the trustees themselves, the descendants of the very families who had first understood that a community's true wealth lay in looking after one another. And she rebuilt the farmhouse above the restored chapel, not as a private home alone, but as a modest gathering place, a continuation, in her own quiet way, of the promise Reverend Pratt had extracted from the founding families in his final delirious hours, that whatever became of the town, what he had built would not be allowed to be forgotten. Word of Margaret's discovery and the restored chapel traveled well beyond the borders of Redstone County in the seasons that followed, and travelers began arriving. At first out of simple curiosity and then, increasingly, drawn by the quieter pull of a genuine story of restoration, in a territory that had seen more than its share of hardship and loss. Margaret welcomed them without ceremony, showing anyone who asked the narrow stone stairway and the chapel below, telling the story plainly and without embellishment, always ending with the same words her father had once spoken over their own modest fields, that the land holds what the people put into it, long after the people themselves are gone. The relief fund, meanwhile, grew steadily under the trustees' careful stewardship, easing the hardship of no fewer than 6 families in its first 3 years alone, a widow given seed corn much as one had been decades before. A young couple helped through a hard winter after a barn fire. The pattern of quiet, unglamorous goodness her mother had first recorded now continuing, unbroken, into a new generation. She was 20 years old when she paid $9 for a piece of ground every farmer in the county called worthless, a young woman with nothing but circumstance and grief, cast off by an uncle who saw no value in keeping her. What she could not have known, standing in that wind-scoured dooryard with the last of her money spent, was that her father's old conviction, that the land holds what the people put into it, long after the people themselves are gone, was not simply a comforting saying he had offered a child to soften the hardship of prairie life, but something closer to a literal truth, waiting patiently beneath her own feet for someone with the patience to notice a hollow sound beneath a rotted board, and the courage to climb down into the dark to see what her family and her town had never truly lost, only misplaced beneath the slow accumulation of hard years and forgotten grief. There is a particular kind of justice in the way the story settled, one that Margaret herself remarked on more than once in the years that followed, standing in the restored chapel on a Sunday morning with the congregation her family had helped found once again gathered beneath its roof. The land that Redstone County had called worthless had, in fact, held more value than any of the county's productive, well-watered farms. Not the kind of value that could be measured in bushels or dollars alone, but the older, deeper kind her father had always insisted mattered more. The accumulated trust and care of people who had chosen, in their hardest year, to build something that would outlast them. Cornelius Abbott, for his part, resigned his position at the Fenwick Bank within 2 years, his reputation for careful, unquestionable dealing considerably diminished among a county that had watched, with quiet satisfaction, an orphaned young woman with $9 and a dead father's ledger prove him wrong. Margaret's uncle, Garrett Doss, sent word once, some years later, offering a stiff and uncomfortable congratulations on her fortune, along with a suggestion that family ought to look after family. A suggestion Margaret answered with nothing more than a polite, brief letter thanking him for his good wishes, understanding by then, with a clarity she had not possessed at 20, that some doors were better left closed gently than slammed, and that the family she had built for herself in Amity Hollow's restored congregation was, in every way that mattered, family enough. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Margaret's story tonight. If her journey moved you, we would be so grateful if you shared it with someone who has ever been told that what they carry, or what they've been left with, is worth nothing at all. Perhaps you know a piece of ground, or a house, or even a person that the world has already quietly written off, without ever pausing to look closely enough to see what might still be waiting there, patient and overlooked. We would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real value or real meaning in something the rest of the world had already written off. We read every one of them, and we are always glad you are here. Until next time, stay close.